Good morning, everyone. If you was not here on Tuesday, could you please let me know your job title or even just a quick blurb about your duties just to make sure I am meeting your learning needs today? I want to first go ahead and validate my presence here by saying that I have over 15 years of experience in the application of EdTech and supporting pragmatic transformations for several type of sectors that include healthcare, business, education, government. And I've been lucky enough to have a perspective that I can use and leverage to increase my cultural competence in instruction and to guide those in leadership positions, right, for their discernment to create measurable and relevant change. So that's why we've been giving these sessions today on advanced accessibility because I'm under the guise that you all are in a position that you are responsible for digital accessibility for whether it's web or documents or for a multitude of different audiences. I understand how this lack of equitable digital access and like this big digital gap that we have, how it adversely impacts particular communities. And that's why I went on to go to school and earn a doctorate and a master's and then get another doctorate. I just wanted to know so much about why this digital gap existed, what we could do to narrow the gap, and it provided me with these unique opportunities to engage in not only accessibility, but also access. And I actually also sit on the board of W3C, WCAG, and the AREA project, and we'll talk more about that. You'll hear me mention W3C, WCAG a lot because that is what the federal government, the guidelines the federal government supports. I'm currently collaborating with W3C on the next generation of the success standards, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, and we're also about to head over to 2.2. So this is a great time. It's a great opportunity to inject all these different diverse perspectives on how we can improve these refreshed guidelines, not only from you all as developers or content creators, but also from our users. I was on the team that was tasked to develop specific standards of communicating accessibility, evaluation results, and some of the methods that support precisely how we should document these processes. My expertise really centers on WCAG conformance testing, where I'm able to translate conformance standards issues and how to use plain language in conformance standards. My best practice is just to really ensure that we are communicating to our users authentically and to our peers and colleagues in a way that makes sense and that's pragmatic and practical. And we also want to provide explanations of conceivable experiences for differently abled users. And I do prescribe to reproduce these access and accessibility environments and test for resolutions that way we can have a practical approach and a pragmatic approach when we're outlining these suggestions and recommendations for achieving conformance. That's why at WCAG, the guidelines always say recommendations because honestly, that's all we can do. It's recommend. We are not a legal authority and we cannot legally say you must do this, you must do that. That is the federal government's job, and they have the Americans with Disability Act that supports them in that. So what we do, however, is we use the ADA and we built these guidelines in a way that to make sure that everyone is in adherence with the federal ADA and all of its iterations, as well as the ICT, the Communications and Technology Act as well. Just to let you know what's going to happen, I usually will do a little bit of activities in between our conversations, and we'll take a break at about 50 minutes or so. Then we'll come back and we'll leave for about 30 minutes, and then we'll come back and probably wrap up. I'll try not to hold you too long because I do have resources that you can take away with you. I will make sure that those are posted on the SharePoint so that you can have those to refer to. And of course, I'm always accessible. So today, what we're talking about here is authoring tools. What we mean by authoring tools, if you're not familiar, we mean your Articulate Storyline, Adobe Captivate, iSpring, Kahoot. There's so many. I can't think of all of them off the top of my head, but authoring tools are these little plugins that we put into websites, courses, and into areas where the public can all see the same thing at the same time. It's usually SCORM compliant so that it is responsive for several different groups of people, meaning if you're using a tablet, you're using a phone, you're using your laptop or your PC, it looks the same for everyone. So it'll be SCORMed into a course, and a website may have it as an embed file. And these are additions or plugins to your existing web product or your web elements. As we go through, if you're not familiar with authoring tools, you might not realize you're using them, and you are. If you are familiar with them, then this is going to be very familiar to you. But if not, then this may be a little bit of new information, and you may be introduced to understanding what we mean when we say authoring tools. So what I'll cover today is these are a few of the things I'm going to cover. This is not a comprehensive list because I'm just going to talk. So I may give additional information, and this is being recorded. So if I do give information that's not in the slide, you will still have a reference if you remember that I said something but you can't quite remember what it was. We have this recorded, and it also will be available for you because not everything is going to be on the screen for you. The big thing here is the item number 2 in our objectives is we're going to review the UAAG, WCAG, and ATAG, mostly ATAG, which is the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guideline. And that is super important for today's conversation. WCAG is also important because that is the umbrella that ATAG and UAAG fall under. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. We'll talk about procurement, but not so much because that is based on your area, your agency, your department. And of course, we're going to talk about authoring tool accessibility, like web content. If you talk about text, or alternative text, thing and link page elements, things of that nature for the first half of today. If you have any questions that you can think of while I'm going through the presentation, feel free to pop it into the chat, and I'll constantly be checking the chat to make sure that I get to your question. But for now, if you could mute your phones just to make sure we're not getting feedback, because I think we have about 20 or so people on the call, something like that. If you can mute your phones just to make sure there's no feedback, that'd be great. And if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat, and I'll make sure that I address them for you. I want to first let you know that there is currently no authoring tool that we are aware of that is 100% accessible that we're aware of. It may exist. They have not told W3C, the Worldwide Consortium, about it, and we don't know anything about it. So we can't advocate for that. Authoring tools, they are pretty good with their, oh yeah, Prezi is also an authoring tool. Forgot to mention that. And infographics, that's another one that a lot of people use and don't realize it's an authoring tool. Every authoring tool will require, even if you somehow are using a automatic accessibility checker, it's still going to require your manual touching of the course and looking at the course to make sure that it's accessible to all groups. So some developers are, however, improving the support of the accessibility in their authoring tools, and some utilities may help supplement the gaps that are in existing authoring tools. So don't feel like even though it's not 100% that there's not any other option but the manual, there are tools that could possibly fill in those gaps. We really just want to provide information that might help you find some improved authoring tools. And also, I want to talk about how we can work around the gaps in the existing authoring tools. We want to talk about today some questions that you can ask vendors regarding accessibility support in current and upcoming product versions of whatever it is you're using, according to their conformance with the W3C's ATAG 2.0 version. Now, ATAG has a 1.0 and a 2.0. Not a huge difference, not a big difference like from WCAG 2.0 to 2.1. From 2.0 to 2.1, there were 17 different revisions that were made. So it was kind of a big lift. ATAG 1.0 or 2.0 is not a big lift. If you are familiar with 1.0, there are just a few things different in 2.0, but that's just to support WCAG 2.1. So don't be thrown off if you're using a different version of ATAG. As we discussed on Tuesday, for those who were here, UAAG and WCAG has one additional, I guess you say, additional acronym that I didn't go into a lot of detail on, and that's ATAG. And I told you that we would talk about that a little later because it's a little bit more detailed than what I could go over in a little bit of time we had. So we had to dedicate a day to go over ATAG, which is for your authoring tools. Now, this covers software, and it's used to create, this software is used to create, say, your web pages or your applications, and this definitely includes your mobile devices as well. So just to go over real quick, UAG, it covers your web browsers for those who identify as differently abled, of course, and those who use the web on mobile devices. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is WCAG. This also covers web pages and your web applications, including content used on mobile devices as well. And then you have your ATAG, which covers software used to create a web page or an application or learning object or a web element. And it also includes mobile. So all of these are inclusive of mobile accessibility. It is necessary. This is a diagram that is used often. It was developed by WCAG, and you'll see it used in a lot of the WCAG documentation. So you'll get to see this because it kind of shows where everyone falls in line and how the workflow is when it comes down to from the content to the technical spec. Those that are should be accessible to each and every person. We want that accessibility to be irrespective of age, your level of literacy, or any potential physical disabilities you may have. And accessibility of web portals refer to the degree to which it's available to as many, the most ubiquitous group as possible. In order to achieve this, the Worldwide Consortium, or W3C, launched the Web Accessibility Initiative, which is WAI. We launched this in April of 1997. The WAI consists of several working groups. One of those working groups was ATAG. That's where this came from. Each of their specific focuses were on computer science, engineering, application, the journal of few technical journals, and they came up with the ATAG guidelines. So this is a schematic representation of the guidelines that include WCAG 2.0, ATAG 2.0, and UAAG. There are significant interdependencies. We'll see that as we go through these, that between the components. That means that the components, they're going to have to work together in order for the web to remain or even be accessible for anyone. For example, in order for the alt text on images, the technical specs address alt text with and define HTML as ALT. That's how an example of the technical specs. If they were to define an image element, it would be IMG. WAI guidelines, they defined how to implement alt text for accessibility in different components. That was their primary focus. They wanted to look at different web elements and see how these technical specs would would fit in with that. Developers, they provided the appropriate alt text language. The authoring tools they enable, they facilitate, they promote, and they also provided the alt text in the web pages. Evaluation tools, they help check that the alt text is actually there, that it exists. Now, user agents, and you'll hear me use user agent a lot. That's UAAG, that's the user agent accessibility guidelines. User agents provide humans and machine interfaces to the alt text. So a user agent would be something like WCAG. That is considered an agent. Assistive tech, or you'll hear me refer to it as AT, it provides the human interface to the alt text in various modalities. So that could be your JAWS, your window eyes, NVIDIA, different types of, or your Braille readers. Those are all assistive tech. And then we have our users. They should know how to get the alt text from the user agent and or their AT as necessary. So that's how you can see this schematic and this workflow, how they are all interdependent of one another. The Authoring Tool Accessibility Guideline, or ATAG, it makes the authoring tool itself accessible so that, or as accessible as possible for people with disabilities so they can actually create web content. And that's where it gets a little dicey. The diciness comes in that ATAG is not necessarily focused on whether the tool is accessible once it's published. It's looking at, is it accessible so that anyone can create using it? And in that process, is also going to help you create more accessible web content automatically. More specifically, it enables, it promotes, supports the production of content that's WCAG conformant. And ATAG is actually just part of the series of accessibility guidelines that includes WCAG and and UAAG. As we spoke about earlier, this is just a part of those three guidelines that we follow. ATAG is recommendations that are created by a working group. This working group is only focused on accessibility of authoring tools. It is an international standard. It is an international standard for maintaining and verifying accessibility. And the first version came out in about 20 years ago, about February of 2000. And then that was ATAG 1.0. So as you can see, ATAG 2.0, which came out in about 2015, 15 years later, the guidelines, and of course, we know that the technology changed significantly from 2000 to 2015, especially with authoring tools. But there is not a lot of additional standards that came out 15 years later. And that's because a lot of those standards were covered by WCAG. The User Agent Accessibility Guidelines, the UAAG, is also has its own working group. And it wants to verify that user agents as well as the AT, the assistive technology, is accessible. It's also an international standard, and it is to just maintain and verify accessibility of different agencies like your web browsers, your media players, and your SAT or your assistive technology like your speech to text and synthesizers and all that. So the first version of UAAG, it came out in 2002. And later it added some extra features and it removed some of the limitations that were in the way. Went on and got rid of those because the technology had changed quite significantly. So the last working draft of UAAG, which is 2.0, was published in 2015. It has 26 guidelines that are based on 5 principles that are extremely similar to WCAG principles: perceivable, operable, understandable. But then we added programmatically accessible, and then some specifications and conventions as well. So accessibility of web portals, they can be controlled and improved in 3 ways: by following ATAG for the authoring tools during the creation of web portals, by controlling the contents of the web using WCAG, and then by controlling the features of the user agent or UAAG. So there are some studies out there that found that accessibility analysis of some of the components of the web portals mainly fell on the lap of WCAG 2.0 recommendations. So that kind of set at the top of the pyramid because a lot of the standards that were necessary due to technology were based on those as opposed to UAAG and ATAG. So you'll hear me discuss WCAG quite a bit because ATAG actually is the child and WCAG is the parent. I guess that's the easier way of me saying it. If I were, oh, activity. Here, select the correct order, and I'm going to put a poll up real quick on your screen, and the poll is going to give you some options. Select A, B, or C. Which one is UAAG, WCAG, or ATAG? And I'll give you a chance to look at it and then I'll post the poll. Okay, so you can look at either it's A, B, or C. How are we going to match these up? 1, 3, and 2, 3, 1, and 2, or 2, 3, 1. And you should have a poll that shows up on your screen now that's going to give you those options. Okay, about half of you have answered, so I'll give you another minute. And your answers are confidential, so don't worry if you get it wrong. No one will know it was you. Okay, so here are your results. Let's see, about 20 seconds, your results will pop up for you. Oh, yeah, you can't, once you submit, you can't change your answer. Sorry. But it looks like most of you got it correct because only two people did not answer B. So that's pretty good. Um, the poll locked up on me, so I wasn't able to share the results with you. But yeah, the answer is B, 3, 1, and 2, which most of you got that correct. Um, the ATAG covers software used to create, and then WCAG, it it covers the web applications and the content items that, I'm sorry, the content items. Oops, skipped the wrong one. WCAG covers web browsers to benefit those who identify. When I was reading it, I knew it wasn't right. I'm like, that's not right. As differently abled, and they use the web on mobile devices. Okay, and an ATAG covers software use to create web applications for mobile, and UAAG covers your web pages. So let's talk a little bit more about ATAG. ATAG takes care of the authoring tools, including the WYSIWYG tools, which are like your save as HTML conversion tools like word processors, database generation tools, and site management tools. ATAG 2.0 has a companion set of techniques to help software developers implement 2.0, ATAG 2.0 in their products. ATAG 2.0 explains to authoring tool developers how to make their products support accessible authoring practices, generate standard markup languages and general standard markup, how they can support the creation of accessible content, of course. It provides ways of checking and correcting any inaccessible content. Also integrates accessibility support into the overall look and feel of the project or the product. It also promotes accessibility in your help, your knowledge bases type of documentation. And it's also, which is a big one that no one else addressed, it ensures that the tool is accessible to authors who are differently able. And that's where the difference comes in. ATAG 2.0 has two main parts. Part A, just make the authoring tool itself accessible. Is the authoring tool accessible to the general public? And then part B, is the authoring tool helping authors produce accessible content for posting or publishing? In other words, it should help web developers produce web content that is accessible and conforms to WCAG. And it is to be accessible itself so that those who are differently able can use it to create content, whether they are doing a blog comment or a full-time developer working in a web shop. ATAG is organized here in three layers. You have principles, guidelines, and success criteria. It's very similar to WCAG. The principles of ATAG provide a high-level organization for the guidelines. The guidelines provide sort of the framework and objectives for the success criteria. And then the success criteria are the actual accessibility recommendations, and they are written as testable statements. If and they are the testable statements are single A, double A, and triple A, very similar to WCAG. So you can be kind of accessible, sort of accessible to most people, or very accessible. And that's A, double A, and triple A, just like WCAG guidelines. So looking at part A, the authoring tool user interface follows applicable accessibility guidelines by making sure that the web-based functionality is accessible, and as well as the non-web-based functionality is accessible. It wants to make the authoring tool user interface accessible as well. There are 13 guidelines that spread across these four principles. And for the first part, there's 13. The second part, there's, I think, 11. So looking at the first part, A1 has two guidelines that falls under it. It's looking at the authoring tool user's interface. Is it following applicable accessibility guidelines? Meaning, does it function? And this means, does the web portion function as well as the non-web portion? Is that functioning as well? That's all that falls under A1. A2 talks about perceivability. We want to make, when we say perceive, what we mean is alt text or something of that, or some type of alternative control. So we want to make alternative control and content available to authors, not necessarily the general public, but to authors. We want to ensure that the editing view of the presentation of it can be programmatically standardized or determined so that those who are differently able can reproduce using the tool. A3, editing views, they want to make sure it's operable. These standards are very similar to WCAG standards. Operability. When we talk about operability, we want to make sure that it functions like with keyboard access to authoring features. We want to give the authors enough time. So that means we're not timing out. The features in the authoring tool is not timing out. We want to avoid any type of flashing or anything that could cause any type of seizures in a large population. We want to make sure that when they are using the authoring tool, the navigation and editing makes sense, that it's logical. We want to provide a text search. Now, some authoring tools fall short on that on the editing side. Being able to, if you think about Articulate Storyline, if you ever use it, or Captivate, it's extremely difficult for you to do a search of your content if you're authoring the content. So we do fall short there. Managing the preference settings. And we want to ensure that the previews are at least as accessible as what the users are going to see in the real life, or the user agent is going to see. So if I'm publishing a Captivate Storyline presentation, I'm differently able with Vision. When I go to test it and I go on preview mode, I want it to as closely mimic what it would look like in your browser as possible. And we want to make sure, lastly, that the editing views are understandable, meaning we want to help the authors avoid and correct mistakes. We want to also document the user interface, including all of its accessibility features. So let's look at the next set of standards, which are Part B. Part B has quite a few standards, but not as many as Part A, just a few less. Part B has 11 standards. It wants to support the production of accessible content, want to make sure that you are actually producing content that is accessible. B1 says fully automate your process, ensure that the automatically specific content, make sure that that's accessible to everyone, and ensure that the accessibility information is preserved. B2, authors need to be supported in producing accessible material. So we want to ensure that the accessible content production is even possible. We want to give guidance, provide guidance for authors to at least produce accessible content. We want to be able to help them manage alternative content for any non-text elements, accessible templates, and any accessible pre-authored content, meaning they're using like a plugin or say if it's a course of LTI or XAPI or API. B3, support in improving the accessibility of what's already out there. So we want to assist our authors in checking for accessibility issues and repairing these accessibility issues. And B4, we want these authoring tools to promote and integrate these accessibility features. We can do this by ensuring that these features are available during the production of accessible content. We want to make sure that there's documentation that exists and it promotes the production, so a good knowledge base for them to also reach into. Each guideline is then broken down into individual requirements, which is what I mentioned earlier about the success criteria, just like WCAG. Now, each of the success criteria, it is assigned a conformance level. And when taken collectively or all together, it gives the authoring tool an overall conformance level score. There's just like level A means that all success criteria that fall under level A is met, and then level AA means that AA and A has been met, and AAA means that AA, and AAA has been met, just like WCAG. So it shouldn't be any new news there. So I have a quick poll I like to give. Um, so looking here, choose the select, not really order, but just it's organized and ATAG has 3 layers. Which of these 4 options represents the 3 layers of ATAG? And I'll bring a poll up in a second on your screen. Just tell me which of these 4 represent the layers, the ATAG layers that we spoke about briefly. Can you push out that activity again? Because for some reason, the voting, the item doesn't come up. Okay. So you want me to go back and try to bring it up again? If you could. Okay. Let's see here. Does it work for you now? Can you see that slide? Maybe I'll see if it's under the. It's usually a delay, but let me see if. Okay, let me try to open this polling again. Okay. I haven't brought the poll up just yet, so I'll bring the poll up, see if that helps. Oh. Okay, yeah, I haven't posted it yet. I'm going to post it now. Okay, so now you should see the poll. Okay, great, great. So which of these four represent the ATAG layers? And we'll take 2 more minutes. I think you all can see the results. So looks pretty good. Let's see. That four is correct. Principles, guidelines, and success criteria. Very similar to WCAG because it falls right under the same principles as WCAG. If you are looking for new software or you're out searching or seeking to purchase new course authoring or content authoring software, there are three considerations. And you want to ask yourself, firstly, you can just ask yourself these three basic questions. Does the authoring tool currently in use, does it support or does it hinder the production of accessible websites? This is important because you want to be sure to broadly consider the WYSIWYG HTML editors. Conversion tools such as your word processors like Word or PowerPoint that have the option to save as HTML. You want to preserve that. Buttons, any application that generate web pages from databases, any image editors, multimedia editors like your Camtasia that also has some HTML features. Some of your site management tools like your content management systems or like Confluence, Jira. The next question is, does the authoring tool currently in use change or remove accessibility information? For example, the alt text for images. Has that been added by other tools or by hand or by markup language? So does it remove these things? The next question is, for authoring tools that do not support the creation of accessible content, are there plugins or other utilities that can be used with those that can better support the production of this accessible websites or web content? So these are three questions that may help you in ensuring that your authoring tool is as close to accessible as possible. And to keep it short, these are the three considerations. Number one, which applications are more conformant with ATAG? Number two, for which applications are there plugins that can fill any gaps in accessibility support for the primary? Like say, for instance, like we mentioned earlier, if it doesn't support it, is there a way I can add something to it to make it support accessibility? And lastly, which application carries a developer's commitment to continue to improve the ATAG conformance in future versions? For example, I know Articulate Storyline has a way that you can submit a recommendation to them. That's a developer ability, a commitment to continue to improve because they are taking recommendations from the general public. Anyone can go on there and say, hey, you guys need to add this or take this away, or this is just not making sense the way it's set up. So they are always under evaluation for future versions becoming more accessible. Let's look at procurement. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because it is so broad. It does depend on sometimes department, sometimes agency, sometimes down to your leadership in general. If you want to look at reviewing the software procurement practices, you want to ask yourself, does this organization encourage or require the purchase of applications with more advanced support for accessibility? For organizations with a concentration of purchasing power, we want to know, is there an avenue that we can communicate the organization's interests in ATAG conformance software to the vendors so that we are aware of the demand, or so that the vendors are aware of the demand for particular features. So there are some ways that you need to potentially look at how your organization is purchasing software and getting licensing. And is there a commitment to ensure that it is ATAG compliant? Particularly, we're talking about authoring licensing, not just any other things. We're just talking about authoring tools. If you are looking at purchasing that, make sure that, or it may be in your organization's best interest to ensure that leadership and those who may not be aware of ATAG are made aware that it should be ATAG conformant in order to follow the federal ADA. For software vendors, of course, there's tons of questions. I just put a few here. There's a lot more, of course. Your organization probably has specific needs when it comes to your vendors and when you're purchasing authoring software. You want to make sure that the product conforms to ATAG. W3C conformance is ATAG because W3C owns the ATAG child, or whatever. If not, when does the vendor plan to release a conformant version? If they're not conformant, well, is that coming down the pipeline or is that something in the future? Doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to be interested in getting a product. It just means that please let me know that something is coming down the pipeline. What features has the company vendor added to their product that supports web accessibility requirements? Can they demonstrate the existing accessibility support in their product? And usually we're looking at the VPAT. If you're not familiar with VPAT, it's a voluntary accessibility document that is necessary as well as required. If you are a federal contractor or contracting company, it's required. However, most vendors do have a VPAT on file because most of them do work with the federal government and it's required by them. So if you look at the VPAT, you can see what existing accessibility features are there or are not there. And you can just Google the vendor. Like you could Google Adobe Captivate VPAT right now and see what's there. Are there plugins that can be used if it's not conformant to more effectively support accessibility? Can a suite of tools be established to provide the accessibility that the tool lacks? What features has the company added to the project or to the product that support? And who would be a good contact person in the company in concerning accessibility? Meaning, not necessarily that we want to contact them, but we just want to know, is there a dedicated person there that is focused on accessibility? It's nothing different than having a organization that says, oh, we're accessible, and it's like, who's doing that? Are the developers doing that? Because technically the developers aren't 100% going to be knowledgeable on accessibility, because it's a whole area of expertise in itself. But it'd be nice if there was some type of oversight committee, such as a digital accessibility office, not just accessibility office, because we're not looking at structural accessibility. We're looking at digital accessibility, which is a totally different area of focus. Okay, so it's 11. We'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break right now. And we only have a few more slides left, and then we will head into our part two. And you can log off if you like, but you can stay on this line here because I'm coming back to this specific line. I'm not giving you a new number or anything like that. So you can just leave your computer up and just put it on mute if you like. And if you think of any questions, you can pop them in the chat because I'll be here. But we will come back at 11:11, and I'll see you back then. Okay, I hope you all were able to grab some coffee or tea or whatever. And we'll go ahead and finish these last few slides, and we'll take another 30 minutes. Okay, you grab some lunch or something. So let's look at how can we work around if these issues can't be met, right? So until authoring tools are more accessible, which the way technology moves and at the advancement of growth that we're having, it's going to always be playing catch up. So it would be helpful if we could develop some strategies to work around these limitations of our existing tools. And some of those strategies could include becoming familiar with the general concepts at the guideline level, not necessarily on the individual checkpoints, but becoming familiar with the guidelines, just knowing that they exist and knowing where to go to get them, primarily with WCAG and ATAG. If we could identify the key limitations of the authoring tools that we are currently using within our organization, and we could also identify these by noting recurring issues of inaccessible output from those authoring tools. We can notate reading accessibility reviews of the products. We could note feature support of any of the ATAG checkpoints. And several ways we can identify the key limitations. Also, being able to locate the plugins if necessary. If we need plugins, being able to know where to get those, being able to find the utilities that can be used in combination with the authoring tool to correct the inaccessible output. And if more so, we could continuously develop in-house processes and procedures, checklists for ways of correcting the accessibility problems that these tools are generating. So these are just a few workarounds. There are several others. And if you are examining authoring tools or looking into authoring tools, there is a lot of information in the ATAG guidelines, and I'll give you that resource. There's a lot of information in there to give you some recommendations and suggestions on how to get around accessibility issues. Here's some additional strategies for those limitations. If the template that you're using, say if you're using a template, if it provides, if you're provided a template, for example, and it's not conformant to WCAG or ATAG, then you need to consider developing a more conformant template that's appropriate to your organization, and then see how you can get that distributed throughout the organization. If an authoring tool does not create valid markup according to ATAG, you can use it in conjunction with a cleanup tool, such as it's one called HTML Tidy. It'll clean it up for you. If a multimedia authoring tool does not support the creation of captions for audio, which I'm not sure any that don't nowadays, but if not, you can just use it in conjunction with the caption editor like Rev or Level Access. It's several. I use Rev personally because they're cheap, extremely cheap, and they're very reliable and value. Before Rev, we were even using YouTube because they've gotten so good with their captions, because federal guidelines require 80% accuracy and 80 to 90%, I believe. And YouTube is pretty much there. They're pretty good. So they're good for creating free captions. Or if you want more reliable captioning, then I do use Rev, but there's 3Play Media. There's several different individual authoring tool caption services. If you guys use any currently, you can throw it in the chat and share it, but there's Magpie, several. So for authoring system, number 4, for authoring systems primarily designed to produce print media like your Acrobat, your Adobe, your PageMaker, Quark Express, rich media, Director, Flash, which we're getting rid of that. But in case you still have to do Flash, Toolbook, your word processors like Word or whatever IO systems use. I'm a Android fan, so like Word presentations, PowerPoints, freelance Visio. Go back to the original source material where possible, and then generate an accessible HTML or XHTML version from the source. Or you could run the file through a converter if it's available, like a PDF to HTML converter, very commonly found online. They're free. Then check the accuracy of the conversion, or recreate the material in a known accessible format. You could also post the accessible format on the ATAG site. I believe they still have that checker there. ATAG used to have a checker. You can check and see if it's still there. They may have taken it down since the 2.1. But you might be able to run it through a checker there as well, your HTML. Number 5, if an authoring tool is being used to retrofit an existing site and it doesn't prompt for missing alt text, then you can use an accessibility retrofitting tool. One I can think of top of my head is called APrompt, which both prompts for missing accessibility information, and it provides a way to insert the missing information. So that's a very useful and helpful tool if they're still compliant with 2.1 or 2.0. If an authoring tool does not insert a document type declaration, a DTD, that's necessary for validating markup and for conforming to HTML and XHTML, then look for an extension that you can insert, where you can insert the appropriate DTD, or you could do it manually. If an authoring tool does not support CSS, cascading style sheets. Use it in conjunction with a compatible style sheet editor. Number 8, if your authoring tool does not display a linearized version of tables, like a way that makes sense where it's linear, and techniques on how to fix your tables, then go and use a free tool. I'm sure we've all probably used it. It's called Wave, and you could run your table on your site through Wave, and it'll show you if there's an issue and where the issues lie, or some other text browser or text browser emulator. There's several. I think DayQ has one as well. If the authoring tool does not preserve all accessibility information during authoring, transformation, conversions, migrations, either edit it by hand and save it straight to the source, or you may have to get a new authoring tool. That's the biggest thing with us trying to retroact or retrofit documents that were created. Let's say a year ago, someone created this document. It's been circulating the organization. It's not accessible. And now we're trying to go back and make it accessible, but we don't have the source document. That kind of is we see that a lot in PDFs, especially PDFs that look like scanned documents. So you want to run your OCR. If you have the advanced PDF account, then you can convert it back to a Word. And it's pretty accurate, pretty good. If you can do that in your PDF, your advanced PDF editor, I recommend you do that. The reason why is because, say, if you take your PDF document and you try to tag your images and you try to do all of the accessibility needs through the PDF, it's extremely taxing and challenging. And to do headers, you want to go through and do all your headers and everything like that. You don't want to do that in PDF. It just takes too long, and it unnecessarily takes too long. So it's best to just convert it back into Word. Don't quote me on this, but there may even be some free PDF to Word converters online if you don't have the advanced PDF Adobe account. If the authoring tool automatically generates equivalent alternatives, like by inserting file names as alt text, then you want to manually check and make sure that your images, your file names, your tables, graphs, diagrams, charts either have the correct alt text or have appropriate and meaningful surrounding language to give that image context. Now, we could do a whole entire session on alt text, which I'm thinking I might do because it seems to be a problem. But if you have a graph, chart, image, I have been seeing lately a lot of alt text that has described the chart because we can't see it through my screen reader. My screen reader just ignores it, or it just says image or object, or just ignores it altogether. So some of my developers have put in things like chart displaying the weather coming over the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, as alt text. That's fine. We don't ding you for that. However, it would benefit everyone, not only those who are differently able to envision and using the AT, but just anyone who's using the document or reading the document. If you were to put that in its surrounding text, and you could say, as you can see above, this image display, because it helps everyone, not only those who are using AT. If I see an image and the alt text gives me more information than the actual surrounding text, now we're not helping the most ubiquitous group. So think about your alt text. If your alt text is more than one sentence, then you may want to consider it as being context in the surrounding text of the item or the element. I hope that's clear. I don't know if I said that right. I use a lot of words. I don't know if I said it right. So, product reviews, I'll just touch on this briefly. The ATAG working group, they periodically review authoring tools to test conformance, right, with 2.0. As of the last revision of the 2.0, the reviews available from the working group were not really up to date. They may not really represent the latest progress in ATAG conformance. The working group for ATAG, they update these product reviews in a collaborative way with developers. They use feedback and things like that. So it takes a while. In some cases, developers have information on their own sites describing the degree of accessibility support for their specific product. The W3C does maintain links to accessibility pages for many developers. Developers with accessibility pages, they may contain links to plugins which enhance the capability of an authoring tool to support the production of accessible websites. So just keep that in mind. If you run across a authoring tool that you're interested in using and you say, well, I'm going to run it through ATAG to make sure that, see if there's a review on it. Keep in mind that that may not, 2.0 ATAG may not have the most current information because the technology changes so quickly. So you can often just go to that developer site. If you're federal government, you can look at their VPAT and get VPAT has to be updated. That's mandatory. So always go revert back to the VPAT or that vendor's website to get their most current information on their product's accessibility. Don't rely 100% on ATAG 2.0 site. So the Accessibility Education and Outreach Working Group, the AEOW, they published this ATAG report tool for authoring tools because they are software and services that are used to create web content, like your CMSs and your WYSIWYG, HTML editors, whatever. W3C's authoring tool, the ATAG, it addresses making the tools themselves accessible and helping the authors create the content as accessible. So if I were you, if you have the chance or if you have time, there's a new ATAG reporting tool that I have not had a chance to look and test myself, but it's evaluates and provides information to your project managers, your procurement officers, and anyone else who needs to know how well a potential authoring tool supports accessibility. However, like I said before, always refer to that vendor's ATAG as well as their website if possible, because W3C, WCAG is not a legal authority. All we do is make recommendations. We make recommendations and suggestions based on the legal authority, which is the ADA. And the federal government enforces the ADA through the VPAT. So if you can, make sure that you access that to get, are they single A, double A, or triple A? federal government requires AA. Not only saying federal government, I'm saying any person, persons, organization, business, company that uses federal funds. That's where the confusion comes into play when we talk about the ADA and we try to delineate Section 508 from 504. I don't think delineating 508 from 504 is what's important. I think we need to understand that ADA applies if you are getting in, even receiving money from the federal government at any capacity, including student loans. And people forget about that part. It's like, well, we're not a government agency, so we don't fall under 508. Do you receive federal funds? Yeah, because your students get student loans. Therefore, you fall under 508/504. Because you are considered a representative, you're representing the federal government, so you must make sure that your content is accessible. So even though ATAG does have this reporting tool, which I haven't done a lot of research into because I'm always going to fall back on the VPAT personally, please, I recommend and suggest that you do the same on any, not only authoring tools, but any type of product that is being sold or any type of software that's being sold to the federal government or to any entities that accept money from the federal government, like consultants, things like that. You ask for their VPAT. Usually it's on their website. If it's not, just email them and say, hey, can I see your VPAT? Most of the time they have it posted because they're usually pretty proud of it, especially if they're AA. If they're hiding their VPAT, it's probably because they don't meet the AA requirements. And if you doesn't mean the federal government won't procure from them. It's just that if someone comes along that is AA, like a competitor, most likely they're going to get the contract before this person who's not accessible would get it because they meet the federal guidelines. And in some RFPs, I've even seen where they say you have to meet AA in order to even bid on some of the contracts that are out there. So the way they prove that is by posting their VPAT, and you can usually find it on their website. If you Google the company, then Google VPAT right behind their name, you'll usually see something come up. It's a pretty extensive report. These conformance levels, I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with WCAG. If you were in session on Tuesday, you're probably a little bit more familiar than you were before. This has AA, ATAG has AA, single A, and AAA. The Accessibility Education and Outreach Working Group, they published this ATAG report tool. These companies that I spoke about earlier, they are being evaluated by this group to make sure that they are creating output that's accessible and making sure that developers are using it in an accessible way, making sure it's accessible to developers as well as those consumers. So conformance level A means that all priorities on checkpoint 1 are satisfied and so on and so forth. Now this is a diagram that is very closely associated with W3C, WCAG. So you can Google this diagram and you'll see it. And it's showing you the regular priority checkpoints of ATAG, WCAG, and also some of the ISO. And you'll see they are very, very similar. They're almost identical. So if they are WCAG accessible through WCAG, most likely they shouldn't have a problem with ATAG if they can meet WCAG. ISO is not something that we really focus heavily on because it's not as ubiquitous. It doesn't meet the most group of people that, because we also look at access. We're not only looking at accessibility, we're looking at access as well. So we're going to focus on WCAG and ATAG and UAAG, of course. the user agents, your browsers and things of that nature. So these are the three levels, and it does fall in line with WCAG. Oh, here's an activity. What are three considerations when selecting an authoring tool? I spoke about this a while ago, but there are three considerations that you need to really think about when you are looking at any of these authoring tools out there. And I'll bring up the poll. Give me 1 second. Okay, so let's take about 2.5 minutes or so and answer the poll there. What are the three considerations? Is it one, two, three, or four? Getting several different answers. Okay. This might be a tough one. It's not as Googleable, but you might can Google it. Okay, we'll take another minute, a minute and a half. Okay, so we'll go ahead. Let's look at the results here. Let's close the poll. As you can see, those who were able to get their answer in felt like it was C, that it was number 3. That is correct. Of course, I expected you guys mostly to get that correct. Conformance, plugins, and future versions. That's the considerations when selecting the authoring tool. We're not looking at the principles of ATAG because the principles, I mean, it's not what we're going to be considering. It's either they meet them or they don't. It's not really under consideration. What we want to know is, are they conformant to WCAG, not necessarily the principles of ATAG, because if they can meet WCAG, then that's fine. They're going to meet ATAG. We want to look at the plugins, and we also want to look at the future versions. Let's look at next some of the resources that we have here. I provide you with these specific hyperlinks because I feel like these are probably the best hyperlinks to get you started on your way with understanding the conformance. If you get a chance, this will be posted on your SharePoint. I can also, if you like, I will also put these in the chat. So if you want to get a head start on it, you can. Because I just feel like the more you become familiar with it, then the more comfortable you will be with identifying when something isn't right. And honestly, as an accessibility specialist, I look at items often from my developers and designers and I say, how do you think that I am supposed to navigate this? And how is it that you could expect me to and it's like I didn't think that. Oh, we don't have any blind students here. Well, my question is, how do you know that you don't have any blind students if they're online? Well, no one told me they were blind because they shouldn't have to. If I have to tell you that I can't see what you're doing, then that means your stuff is not compliant, right? So you should never know that your users, students, audience, you should never know if they're differently able. You should never know if they have limited dexterity, if they are using a head wand or a sip and puff or any type of assistive technology. You shouldn't know that. If you are aware of that, then your content is not accessible because someone has had to come and tell you, I can't see this, I can't use this, I can't navigate, it's too many clicks, it's too much scrolling. So I'll give you an example is I was looking at a website that had a manual. They had their manual on the website. It was in a PDF. It was like 70 something pages. However, it didn't have a table of contents. Outside of that, it was pretty accessible. But I asked the developer, how, if I'm using a head wand, how am I, that means I'm not using a keyboard. They're like, oh, it's keyboard accessible. Sure it is. I'm not using a keyboard. I'm using a head wand because my hands either don't work or I have tremors or whatever. Or they're not there. I don't have any hands. Whatever the case may be. I'm using a head wand to navigate your site. How am I going to get to page 30? You mean to tell me I have to do this for like all the way? That is exhausting and it's not fair. Or to make it accessible, just add a table of contents. The reason why, looking back, a table of contents isn't there is because there were no headers. Therefore, the original Word document has to have headers in order for it to create and generate an active table of contents, so that not only individuals who are differently able can navigate, but people who just know what information they want to see. That's where we get into UAAG. And that's when we get into the user experience. I just know what I want to see. I don't want to have to scroll through 70 pages of your website or your manual to get to the information because I know what I want. I just don't know what page it's on. That's basic. But also, it's not fair to someone who may be differently able to not be able to navigate just because you didn't create it in an accessible way. And I mean, that's just something that's easily overlooked. It's something that a lot of developers are not aware of, especially in PDF documents, particularly if they inherited PDF and they don't have the Word. I cannot stress to you the importance of please try to either convert it over to Word, make it accessible by using the accessibility checker in Word. Word has a free accessibility checker. Go to File, Info, check for issues, and then you'll see the accessibility checker. The accessibility checker will check the entire document and tell you what's wrong and also tell you how to fix it. Once you do that, file, save it as a PDF, and now you're accessible for the most part. Some things may not carry over. Still have to make sure that you are tagging your images appropriately. With the new version of Word, you can just click the button that says it's decoration, such as your logos. If it's something that's an image depicting or a graph that's depicting something that needs context, put the context in the document as opposed to in the alt text. There is an enormous amount of information available online as to how to fix your alt text. I recommend, if you have an opportunity, to look at WAI's resource on alt text. It's one of the best I've seen. But these four resources right here tell you the guidelines in ATAG. It gives you the information on how to, the second one tells you how to incorporate ATAG 2.0. The third resource I gave you tells you how to choose and use W3C or WCAG, compliant and conformant. And The ATAG 2.0 is actually the conformance claims or standards. That document is fluid, changes daily, probably. So always check back to that original source because that information is not static. And if you get a chance, please go and take a look at W3C, WCAG, and its membership. It's open. I mean, you have to pay for the membership, but if you can join a working group is fun, and it's free, and it gives you a lot of information, and you learn from just joining the working group. If you want to become a member, of course, that's something your organization would have to sign you up for. But if you just want to be in a working group, it doesn't cost anything. All right, so that will conclude this session one. The next session is more technical in nature. We're going to be talking a lot more about ARIA and coding. So it's going to be more so for the developers and the designers who are doing a little bit of coding, HTML coding, and how to look at your code. Like, for example, I look at the inspector of a website and I can see that something's not right just by looking at the inspector. And I'm going to show you how we do that. You don't have to run it through Wave or anything like that. Sometimes you can just hit the inspector and look at it and say, okay, this is not going to work because of these certain things. And I'll show you that in the next session if you'll come back and join us. You should have received a invite for the next session because it is a different logon and it's a different number. So we will reconvene at 12:30. We're going to reconvene for the next session, and you can select that invite contact information. I'm sorry. Oh, thought somebody said something. That information should be in your inbox or in your invite. But if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to shoot me an email through the invite or even go ahead and log in and shoot me an email through the text if you're going to be, or through the chat if you're going to be in the next session. And I've had a great time. And if you guys have any questions, please, please, please feel free to put those in the chat because I'll be here for the next 10 minutes if you need me.